on the scorched sands of HFY 7, where water is worth more than gold. A desperate alien girl risked everything for a single sip, and nearly paid with her arm. Her name was Orza. Emerald-skinned, silver-haired, a ghost slipping between shadows in the dying marketplace of Dry Well. She stole because she had no choice. Her father was dying, and no one cared. And when the enforcer caught her, when the blade rose to sever her hand, the world around her froze, until he appeared. A human. A stranger. A storm wrapped in sun-scorched skin and piercing blue eyes. With nothing but a voice, and a fearless step forward, he shattered the cruel law of a dying world. This is the story of how a single act of compassion ignited a bond stronger than worlds apart, and changed the fate of a dying planet forever. The moon hung low, a silver sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the world below. A dense fog crept along the ground, thick and cold, as if the earth itself was exhaling its final breath. Orza stood at the edge of the forest, her hand pressed against the rough bark of the ancient oak. Its surface was cool to the touch, but beneath it, she could feel something older than time itself, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Behind her, the village lay silent, its distant lights flickering like dying stars. The comforting warmth of the hearths was a memory now, a flicker of something long gone. All that remained was the forest, its dark edge beckoning her forward. Logan stood beside her, his face shadowed, unreadable. His gaze was fixed on the path ahead, the one they had spoken of only in whispers. "You don't have to do this, Orza," he said, his voice steady but heavy with an unspoken warning. She glanced at him, her expression hardening. "I don't have a choice." They are waiting. The air around them felt thick with anticipation, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the first move. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted limbs reaching out to greet them, but offering no comfort. Their bark was gnarled and dark, each one an ancient monument to time's relentless march. The wind rustled through the branches, and in its whisper, Orza could almost make out the faintest of words, names, perhaps, or memories long forgotten. Logan took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked into the depths of the forest. "It's not safe. You know what the elders warned." "I don't care what the elders say," Orza replied, her voice sharp. "This is the only way to stop it." He turned to her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else, something darker. "What if it's already too late? What if this forest has claimed us all?" The question lingered between them, thick and heavy, but Orza shook her head. "I don't believe in that. Not yet. Not until I see it with my own eyes." The forest before them was alive, not in the way of animals or plants, but in something older, something primal. The trees whispered as they swayed in the wind, their voices low and nearly indecipherable. The fog thickened around them, creeping closer as if it, too, wanted to draw them in. Every step they took seemed to drag them deeper into the unknown, where light was swallowed whole, and shadows took on lives of their own. Logan stepped cautiously behind her, the weight of his hesitation palpable in the space between them. His fingers brushed the hilt of the dagger at his side, a tool of protection that, in this place, might not offer any. Orza didn't look back. She didn't need to. The pull of the forest was stronger than anything behind them. As they moved further in, the air grew colder, sharper. The distant hum of the village faded into the distance, replaced by an unnatural silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The only sound was the crunch of their feet against the underbrush, each step echoing in the emptiness. Then, a flash of movement in the corner of her vision. Orza stopped, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shifting fog and the darkened trunks of trees. Logan's hand found her arm, and for a moment, he was silent, watching the same shadows that she had seen. "It's always like this, isn't it?" he said quietly, his words barely audible. "A moment of peace before everything shatters." Orza said nothing. She had learned long ago that words were not enough in places like this. Only action. Only trust. They continued forward, the mist swirling thicker now, nearly choking the air. With each step, the path became harder to follow, as though the forest itself were trying to erase their progress. And then, just as she thought they might lose their way entirely, something flickered in the distance. A faint, pale light glowing through the fog. "There," Orza whispered. "It's close." Logan hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure? It could be a trick of the light. Something more sinister." Orza didn't answer him. She simply moved forward, drawn by the light, the promise of whatever it was that lay ahead. The forest seemed to watch her as she moved, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Her breath quickened, but she did not stop. Not now. The fog parted before her like a curtain, revealing a clearing in the heart of the forest. The pale light grew brighter here, pulsing with an eerie, unnatural glow. At the center of the clearing stood an altar, ancient and covered in moss. Vines coiled around its base, and strange symbols were carved deep into the stone, symbols that Orza had never seen before. She stepped closer, her fingers tingling as they brushed against the cold stone. And that's when she felt it, something ancient, something powerful beneath her skin, crawling through her veins like fire. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, a low, deep vibration that echoed in her chest. "This is it," she murmured, her voice trembling with both awe and fear. Logan's hand tightened around her wrist. "We should go. Now." But it was already too late. The shadows around them began to shift again, and the light from the altar flickered, casting strange, elongated shapes across the clearing. A low sound, like a chant or a whisper, filled the air, voices, soft and distant, but unmistakable. And then, the ground shook with a sudden force, and the earth split open. The night was thick with the scent of damp earth and the rustling of unseen creatures. Orza's heart beat louder than the forest itself, and with each step, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, as though they were alive, watching her every movement. The trees towered above her, their branches twisting like skeletal arms, reaching toward the sky in a silent plea for something, perhaps the stars, perhaps the moon, but they received nothing. Beside her, Logan moved silently, his gaze constantly shifting between the path ahead and the encroaching darkness. The forest felt endless, as though it stretched beyond the limits of time and space, pulling them deeper into its embrace with every step they took. "Do you hear it?" Orza's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with unease. The woods were alive with a low murmur, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sounds echoed in her mind, just on the edge of comprehension. Logan stopped, his expression darkening. "I hear it. It's always there, lurking just beyond the veil of our senses." The voices were growing louder now, but they were not words, not yet. They were more like breaths, more like thoughts that weren't hers, swirling around her in the wind. She shivered, brushing a lock of damp hair from her face, trying to shake the feeling that the forest itself was closing in. "Is this what you meant by the dark paths?" Orza asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. She had heard the stories, whispers of those who wandered too deep, of the souls who became lost to the forest, swallowed by the darkness. Logan nodded, his face grim. "There's something ancient here, Orza. Something older than the trees themselves. The shadows have always spoken to those who listen long enough. But once they begin to speak your name, it's a sign that it's already too late." Orza's breath caught in her throat as she glanced around. The shadows seemed to be moving now, crawling along the ground like serpents, shifting and changing shape. One moment, they were just dark patches on the forest floor, and the next, they were almost humanoid, twisting in unnatural shapes. She blinked, and they were gone. "I don't like this," she muttered, her steps slowing. Logan's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Don't stop. Not yet. We need to keep moving." But the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, as if the very earth was waking from a long slumber. The whispers grew more urgent, overlapping one another, as though the forest itself was trying to communicate. And then, through the thick fog that had begun to creep in from the edges of the trees, Orza saw a shadow, a figure standing just out of reach, barely visible, but undeniably there. "Did you see that?" Orza asked, her voice breaking with fear. Logan's eyes narrowed. "I saw it. But don't look directly at it." She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" "It's not a person," Logan said softly. "Not anymore. It's part of the forest. Part of whatever lies beneath." The figure was gone before Orza could look again, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there at all. But the feeling of being watched lingered, hanging heavy in the air like the faint smell of decay. They walked on in silence, the oppressive atmosphere growing thicker with every step. The path seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the ancient trees, the whispers swelling around them in a chorus of maddening voices. Orza's head was spinning, she could feel something brushing against her mind, something that didn't belong, pulling at her thoughts, tugging her toward the shadows. Then, without warning, the forest cleared for a moment, and they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Below them, the river churned violently, a dark, twisting mass of water that seemed to pull at the very air around them. The mist that hovered above the river swirled like a living thing, the wind carrying the faint, mournful wail of distant voices. "I think this is where it ends," Logan said, his voice heavy with the weight of some unspoken truth. "This is the edge of the known world. Beyond here, the path is different. It's not meant for mortals." Orza's eyes searched the horizon, but all she could see was darkness. The fog had thickened again, and now there was a sense of pressing urgency, an awareness that something was watching them from just beyond the mist. "It doesn't feel right," Orza said, her words trembling. "I can't explain it. I feel like we are being drawn into something." Logan didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on something in the distance, something hidden beneath the fog. And then, with a look of grim determination, he turned to face Orza. "There's no turning back now," he said, his voice steady. "We have to go forward. Whatever lies beyond this place, we have no choice but to face it." With a final, lingering glance at the fog that seemed to stretch on forever, Orza nodded. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and stepped forward into the unknown, the shadows whispering her name as she crossed the threshold. The air was still as Orza and Logan stood at the edge of the old stone bridge, staring into the fog-covered abyss below. The thick mist wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket, its chill seeping into their bones. The river, once a powerful torrent, now appeared as a silent, unyielding force, flowing beneath the bridge in an almost unnatural calm. There was a sense of foreboding in the air, a weight that pressed down on them. The world beyond the fog felt distant, unreachable, as though the bridge was not just a passage over the river, but a barrier between two realms. Orza could feel it now, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the uncanny silence that hung in the air. "Do you think we should cross?" Orza's voice was barely more than a whisper, the question lingering in the stillness between them. Logan didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand over the rough stone of the bridge's edge, his fingers tracing the ancient symbols carved into it. The symbols, faded by time, seemed to pulse under his touch, as though they were alive, waiting. "This place, it's older than anything we've seen," Logan murmured, his voice low and filled with a kind of reverence. "Older than the stories. There's something here, Orza. Something hidden." Orza's eyes darted nervously to the shadowy outlines of the forest on the far side of the bridge. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. There was no sound, no movement in the woods, just an oppressive stillness. The air tasted of earth and decay, and the whispers that had been haunting her thoughts grew louder, more insistent. She turned back to Logan, her gaze meeting his. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she couldn't place. Fear? Dread? Maybe both. "If we cross," Logan continued, his voice tight, "we won't be the same. The path beyond this bridge, it doesn't lead where we think." A gust of wind swept through, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail from deep within the fog. It was a sound unlike any animal cry, soft, but filled with a sorrow that tugged at the edges of their sanity. What was that? Orza asked, her heart pounding. Logan's expression hardened. Don't listen to it. We're not alone here. But the sound didn't stop. It echoed again, louder this time, closer. A soft rustling came from the trees, as though something was moving within them slowly, deliberately. The whispers returned too, but this time, they weren't just in Orza's mind. She could hear them clearly, muttering in the wind, their words unintelligible but insistent, coaxing her toward the unseen path. Logan. I feel it, Orza said, her voice trembling. Something's waiting for us. Logan didn't respond. Instead, he moved to the center of the bridge, standing in silence, his eyes scanning the mist ahead. He seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. His hand tightened around the hilt of his knife, his knuckles pale from the grip. Then, as if on cue, the mist parted just slightly, revealing a faint path on the other side. It was barely visible, almost hidden beneath a blanket of creeping vines and brambles. The ground on that side looked untouched, unnaturally still, as if it had been waiting for them. It's calling us, Logan said softly, his voice barely above a breath. But I don't know if we're ready to answer. Orza took a step forward, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but her feet moved on their own. There was something pulling her, an unseen force that tugged at her very soul. She had to know what was on the other side. She had to see it for herself. Without thinking, she stepped onto the bridge. As soon as her foot touched the ancient stones, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and the world seemed to distort. The bridge, once solid beneath her feet, began to feel unstable, as though the very foundations of reality were crumbling away. Her breath hitched as the mist thickened around them, the darkness closing in, swallowing the world whole. The wailing grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all around them. The words were no longer unintelligible, they were clear, though they carried an ancient, terrible weight. Return, leave, or join us forever. The voice was not just one, it was many, overlapping, rising and falling like a tide. Orza felt her heart racing, her breath shallow. She wanted to run, to turn back, but she couldn't. Logan reached out, grabbing her arm firmly. We can't turn back now, he said, his voice shaking. We've crossed the threshold. There's no going back. But Orza wasn't listening. She was staring at the path ahead, the one barely visible through the mist. The ground seemed to pulse beneath her feet, calling her forward with every step. She could see something ahead. A figure, perhaps. Or just a shadow. I have to know what's ahead, she said, more to herself than to Logan. And without another word, Orza began walking, the whispers guiding her, the shadowy figure in the distance drawing nearer with each step. As she crossed the bridge, Logan followed, but not without hesitation. He could feel it too, the pull of whatever lay ahead. And though he feared what awaited them, he knew they were already too far gone to turn back. The forest was alive with sounds that were not of this world. Every step they took deeper into the woods seemed to pull them farther away from reality. The trees loomed tall, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, gnarled and covered in moss. The air was thick, dense, with a low mist that clung to the ground like a shroud, wrapping around their ankles as they moved. Orza and Logan walked side by side, their faces illuminated only by the dim glow of their flashlights. The moon above was hidden behind dark clouds, casting the woods in a perpetual twilight. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Do you hear that? Orza whispered, her voice barely audible. Logan didn't answer at first. His eyes scanned the shadows, alert. The woods had always been unsettling, but tonight was different. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong, a deep, gnawing unease that seemed to grow with each passing moment. I hear it, he said finally, his voice tight with something Orza couldn't quite place. It's not natural. A soft, echoing whisper seemed to carry on the wind, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a low, almost indistinguishable murmur, a language that felt ancient old, forgotten words that clung to the edges of the mind. Orza could feel them pulling at her thoughts, like a melody she almost recognized, but could never quite remember. "Logan," she said, her voice trembling now. "What are they saying?" Logan stopped walking and turned to face her. His expression was grim, as if he had been expecting this moment. "They are not meant to be heard," he replied quietly, his eyes darting nervously toward the dense thicket ahead. "This forest is old, older than anything we know. The whispers come from the roots themselves, from things buried long before us." Orza swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to ask more, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at her mind, drowning out her thoughts. They were speaking in a language that felt like it was reaching inside her, twisting her memories, pulling her closer to something she couldn't understand. A sudden movement in the corner of her vision made her freeze. Someone was standing just beyond the trees. A figure, draped in shadow, half hidden by the mist. Orza's heart slammed in her chest. "Did you see that?" she gasped, grabbing Logan's arm. Her fingers were cold with fear. Logan's eyes narrowed, his face hardening. "Don't look at it. Don't look directly at it." But it was too late. Orza's gaze was drawn to the figure, and for a moment, she thought she saw a face, a pale, twisted visage, eyes hollow and unblinking, staring right at her. She gasped, stepping back, her pulse racing. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. Logan took a step forward, grabbing her by the wrist. "No. Stay with me. Keep moving." But Orza couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure wasn't human. It was like a shadow, shifting in and out of the mist, its outline constantly changing, as if it were being rewritten by the forest itself. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, it disappeared, vanishing into the fog like a fleeting memory. A chill ran down Orza's spine. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling from the sheer terror of what she had just seen. Logan, sensing her growing fear, pulled her along with him. "Don't stop," he urged. "Keep moving. You can't trust what you see here. It will play tricks on your mind." But it was no use. The forest had already begun to shift around them, the trees bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was alive, changing with every step. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices thick with sorrow, as though they were mourning something long lost, something that could never be recovered. "We shouldn't be here," Logan muttered, more to himself than to Orza. Orza could feel the pull of the forest, its ancient, powerful force, wrapping itself around her. The whispers were beckoning, guiding her forward, urging her to come closer to the heart of the woods. She didn't want to go, but the pull was irresistible, as if something deep inside the forest was calling her by name. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches intertwining like the fingers of an unseen hand. It was like the forest itself was alive, its heart beating in rhythm with their own. And then, as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The mist began to lift, the oppressive weight of the forest retreating as if some unseen force had decided they had gone far enough. But Orza knew, deep down, that they hadn't escaped. Not really. The forest had let them go, but it was still there, watching, waiting. As they emerged from the edge of the woods, the air felt lighter, the night less oppressive. But Orza could still hear the whispers, faint but clear in her mind. They weren't done with her yet. "Logan," she said quietly, her voice heavy with dread. "What happens when they find you?" Logan's face darkened, and he didn't answer. He didn't have to. Orza already knew. The forest had marked them. The tunnel stretched before them, narrow and winding, with the faintest echo of their footsteps reverberating through the darkness. Orza and Logan moved in silence, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and age-old dust. There was no natural light here, only the flicker of their flashlights, casting long shadows that danced like spirits across the walls. Every so often, the tunnel would widen, revealing crumbled remnants of what had once been something more: a forgotten workshop, a shattered control panel, half-buried tools, and machines that had long since lost their purpose. It was a place abandoned by time, hidden beneath layers of earth and stone. "Do you ever wonder why it was left like this?" Orza asked, her voice cutting through the silence. She didn't expect an answer, but the question hung in the air, as thick as the dust. Logan didn't respond right away. His eyes were scanning the surroundings, alert, as if searching for something he wasn't willing to speak of just yet. "It's not the first time," he said finally, his voice low. "The past always finds a way of coming back." Orza didn't push him further. There was something unsettling about his tone, a subtle undercurrent of fear. Logan was never afraid. Or at least, he never showed it. But in this place, this forgotten corner of the world, Orza could sense something had shifted. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in, holding secrets that longed to stay hidden. The tunnel curved downward, steepening, and with each step, the temperature dropped, the chill seeping into their bones. Finally, they came to a heavy, rusted door. Its surface was pitted, scarred by years of neglect. It was different from the others they'd passed, newer, more deliberate. There was something about it that felt wrong. "This is it," Logan whispered, more to himself than to Orza. The door stood ominously in front of them, its metal surface marked by strange symbols etched deep into the material. Ancient and unfamiliar, the marks seemed to shift under the beam of their lights, as if alive. Orza's heart quickened, a sense of foreboding creeping over her. Logan took a step forward, his hand hovering near the door. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if sensing the same thing she was: the presence behind the door, the unseen force that was waiting for them. But there was no turning back now. He pushed against it. The door creaked, protesting against its own weight, but it opened slowly, revealing what lay beyond. A vast chamber stretched before them, bathed in an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The light wasn't natural, but it was there, flickering like the dying embers of a long-forgotten fire. It illuminated strange, archaic machinery, some of it long abandoned, others still humming faintly with life, as though the room itself were breathing, waiting for them to discover its purpose. The chamber was filled with towering pillars, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings, each one more detailed than the last. Orza could make out faint shapes in the carvings: figures, abstract symbols, but they seemed to shift before her eyes, becoming something else entirely when she looked away. But the most striking feature of the room wasn't the machinery or the carvings. It was the large object at the center of the chamber, raised on a pedestal of black stone. Orza felt a sudden pull toward it, an irresistible draw, as if the object were calling to her. She stepped forward, her footsteps echoing through the chamber. Logan moved to follow, but his gaze never left the pedestal, his expression unreadable. The object was dark, metallic, but with an otherworldly sheen. It was perfectly smooth, like it had been crafted by hands that knew no earthly limitations. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a thing that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Its edges curved in impossible ways, and at its center, a deep, pulsing light radiated outward, an iridescent glow that seemed to beckon to them. As Orza reached out to touch it, a sudden cold filled the room, freezing her in place. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. Logan grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as the light from the object began to intensify. "Don't touch it," he warned, his voice sharp, his grip tightening. But it was too late. A low hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor beneath them. The light from the object surged, brighter now, almost blinding. The walls trembled, the air pulsed with an energy that felt ancient, untamed, like it had been waiting for this very moment. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, their meanings revealing themselves to Orza, though she couldn't fully comprehend them. Logan's eyes widened in realization. "We shouldn't have come here," he muttered, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "This place, it's not meant for us." The humming grew louder, a low, resonant sound that filled the chamber. The object on the pedestal began to shift, its form warping and reshaping before their eyes, as if it were alive. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The light dimmed, the hum faded, and the room fell into a heavy silence, as if the very air had been sucked from the chamber. Logan staggered back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Orza's heart was pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She glanced at him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Logan's eyes were wide with something Orza had never seen before: fear. "That," he said, "was a mistake." The air was thick with tension as Orza stepped into the dimly lit room. The walls around her were cold to the touch, their surfaces slick with a fine layer of dust, untouched by time, untouched by life. The room was quiet, unnervingly quiet, but there was something else in the stillness, something faint and unsettling that seemed to pulse through the walls like a heartbeat, a sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the planet itself. Logan was already there, crouched beside a table cluttered with strange devices, their purposes unclear. His back was turned to her, but she could feel his awareness, his gaze following her every move, even if he never turned to look. The room, located beneath the surface of the abandoned mining facility, seemed to belong to another world, an era long past, lost to time. The shadows played tricks on her eyes, dancing across the cracked floor as the flickering overhead lights cast their sickly glow. She moved cautiously, her boots barely making a sound on the floor as she approached the corner of the room. There, a small, half-buried crate caught her attention. It was old, its wood rotting in places, its edges frayed from years of neglect. Yet, there was something about it, something familiar. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the crate, and in that instant, the room seemed to shift. A chill ran down her spine. The air grew heavier, thick with something she couldn't place, as if the very atmosphere was alive, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. "Logan," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might disturb the unnatural quiet that surrounded them. "What is this place?" Logan didn't look up. His hands moved methodically, almost mechanically, as if he were trying to block out the weight of her question. "It's not just any facility," he replied, his voice low, laced with something almost fearful. "This place was never meant to be found. It was abandoned for a reason." Orza felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was something in his words, in the way he said them, that hinted at a deeper truth, something dangerous, something hidden beneath layers of time and dust. She pulled at the crate's fragile lid, the wood creaking in protest as if the very air around them were resisting her curiosity. Inside, she found nothing extraordinary, just a collection of old papers, faded and yellowed with age. But beneath them, something gleamed. A small metallic object, smooth and angular, its surface reflecting the dim light in an unsettling way. Orza's breath caught in her throat as she pulled the object from the crate. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its shape seemed almost unnatural, as though it were crafted not by hands, but by something else entirely. Alien. Otherworldly. "Logan," she said, her voice trembling now, "what is this?" Logan's head snapped up, his eyes widening as they locked onto the object in her hand. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passed over his face: fear, recognition, perhaps both. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. "Put it down," he said, his voice harsh, commanding. "Now." But Orza's fingers tightened around the object, her curiosity overwhelming her caution. There was something about it, a pull, an energy that she couldn't explain. She felt as though she had just uncovered the key to a secret, one that had been buried for far too long. "This," Logan said, his voice barely a whisper, "was never meant to be found. And you have no idea what you've just unleashed." The lights overhead flickered violently, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. A strange hum filled the air, low and vibrating, as if the very walls were reacting to the presence of the object. Orza's heart raced. She could feel it now, the presence in the room, something ancient, something powerful, something alive. The object in her hand began to heat up, its surface growing warmer, pulsing with an almost imperceptible energy. What is happening? Orza asked, her voice a mix of fear and awe. Logan stepped forward, his eyes locked on the object as if it were a snake coiled to strike. We need to leave. Now. But as Orza turned to follow him, the ground beneath their feet shuddered. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the facility, something deep within the planet stirring, as though it had been awakened. Logan grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the exit. Move, he commanded, his tone urgent, his grip tight. But the room wasn't done with him yet. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward them with unnatural speed. It was as if the very facility, alive with its dark secret, was fighting to keep them trapped within its depths. We have to destroy it, Logan said, his voice shaking with a rare edge of panic. Before it's too late. But as they neared the door, a piercing, high-pitched screech filled the air, like metal scraping against metal. Orza spun around, her eyes wide with terror as the crate seemed to shimmer, its contents beginning to glow with an eerie, unnatural light. The object pulsed again, brighter this time. A sound, like an ancient language, echoed through the room, soft at first, then louder, louder, until it became deafening. Orza clutched the object in her hand, unable to tear her gaze away from it. It was no longer just an object, it was a key. A key to something far older than anything she had ever known. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. And that was when Orza realized they weren't alone anymore. The night on Hesper 7 was as oppressive as the day, the twin suns' relentless heat finally subdued by the biting chill of the desert air. The stars overhead seemed to watch with cold indifference, their distant light barely breaking the suffocating darkness. The planet, a forsaken rock, had a rhythm all its own, a rhythm that pulsed with an ancient, secretive energy. Every step on its cracked surface seemed to whisper of forgotten things, things best left undisturbed. Orza and Logan moved through the shadows, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, a subtle reminder of how alone they were in this vast, barren world. Orza's heart beat faster now, not just from the strain of the day, but from something else. The air felt heavier, as though something unseen was pulling at the fabric of time itself. Logan, ahead of her, moved with practiced ease. His presence was steady, grounded, yet there was something unsettling about the way he moved through the night. His eyes, always scanning, always alert, hinted at a history deeper than anything Orza could fathom. She caught herself wondering if the stories he told were more than just words. Were they veils for something darker? Something more dangerous? They reached the spaceport, and it seemed wrong. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the cracked concrete. A low hum filled the air, not the usual mechanical whine of ships preparing to depart, but something older, deeper, as if the ground itself was alive and breathing. The wind carried whispers faint, almost imperceptible, like voices lost in the dust. Logan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Not everyone here is as friendly as they seem." Orza's eyes narrowed. She could feel it too. The unease. The way the night seemed to stretch on forever, like the land itself was waiting, watching, for something. As they passed through the hangar gates, the interior was dim, lit by pale, flickering lights. The ship sat in the corner, an imposing figure, sleek yet ominous, like a predator waiting for the kill. It felt out of place in this world of decay, as though it didn't belong, like a shard of another world thrust into the heart of this desolation. Logan led her up the narrow, creaking ramp, his movements precise, calculated. He didn't say anything, but the air between them thickened with unspoken words, with unasked questions. What was he running from? Or was it something he was chasing? Inside, the ship was eerily silent, the kind of silence that clings to you like a shadow. The walls hummed with power, but it felt wrong. As if they were on the edge of something, on the cusp of a revelation that neither of them was prepared for. Orza followed him down a narrow corridor, the floor beneath her boots echoing with each step. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the beat quickening with every footfall. The door to the medbay slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sterile, cold space, lit by harsh, clinical lights. Logan moved to the diagnostic table, his expression focused as he prepped the equipment. He didn't glance at Orza, but she could feel his attention lingering on her, like he was trying to read her in a way that no one ever had before. The ship, this strange, alien vessel, seemed to pulse around them, its presence like an entity of its own, watching, waiting. As Logan scanned her father's chest with a device, the lights overhead flickered again, casting a momentary shadow over his face. For just a second, the silence grew deeper, more oppressive, as if the ship itself held its breath. "It's worse than I thought," Logan said quietly, his voice low, tinged with something darker. He didn't look at her, but Orza could hear the gravity in his words. She took a step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. But Logan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a small vial from a shelf nearby, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. When he turned back to her, his eyes were hard, unreadable. "He's not just sick," Logan murmured, his voice almost lost in the hum of the ship. "This is something else. Something deeper." Orza's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it then, the truth, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to be unearthed. But what was it? And why did it feel like the ground beneath her was shifting, like the very planet was alive with secrets? "Tell me," she whispered. "What do you know?" But Logan only shook his head, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not yet, Orza. Not yet." And with that, the mystery deepened. They were no longer just on a journey to save her father. They were on the edge of something far more dangerous. Something ancient, something hidden. Something that had been waiting for them all along. In the end, it wasn't strength, or weapons, or even rebellion that changed the fate of Hesper 7. It was something far rarer. Kindness. A stolen flask of water. A human's simple act of stepping forward when no one else dared. And a bond, forged across worlds, that defied law, power, and even fear itself. From the dusty streets of Drywell, to the discovery of an ancient, forgotten network beneath the stars. Orca and Logan's journey proved one thing. Even in the harshest corners of the galaxy, compassion can still change everything. And this was just the beginning. If you want to see where their journey takes them next, and uncover more hidden worlds, ancient secrets, and impossible connections, make sure to subscribe to Alien Chronicles. And join us for the next story among the stars. Because out here, every small act of courage echoes across galaxies.